She spent 10 years searching for answers about her missing brother until a small-town tow yard called with news she never expected. Deep in the Idaho forest, they had found his abandoned car, untouched since the day he vanished. But what Grace Turner uncovered inside wasn't just evidence. It was a hidden secret that rewrote everything she thought she knew. This is the emotional story of a sister who followed the last traces of her missing brother and discovered the truth he left behind. Please support us by subscribing to the channel and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. Let's get started. It had been 10 years since Grace Turner's world stopped turning. Her brother, Nathan, had always been the wild one. Guitar strapped across his back, maps with coffee stains folded into his glove box, and that old green Corolla humming beneath him like it was part of his soul. He left home one June morning, said he was headed out west to find something real. He promised he'd be back by fall. But fall came, and Nathan didn't. No calls, no postcards, no trace. The police gave up fast. No signs of foul play. They said maybe he just didn't want to be found. But Grace knew better. Nathan wouldn't do that. Not to her, not to their mama, who sat every evening by the window for years, watching for headlights that never came. Then one day, long after their mother had passed her heartbroken and hope-worn thin, Grace got a phone call. "We found an old car out in the woods near Clearwater, Idaho. The plates match a missing person case. A Nathan Turner." Grace's breath caught. And for the first time in a decade, she let herself believe she might finally learn the truth. The next morning, Grace was on a flight to Idaho, hands trembling in her lap the entire way. She hadn't been on a plane in years, and certainly not for anything like this. Her mind kept drifting to that call. "We found your brother's car." She whispered it to herself like a prayer, like saying it over and over might make it more real. When she landed, a sheriff's deputy named Carl picked her up. He was kind, quiet, wore his years like a faded denim jacket broken in, but still sturdy. "I was just a rookie when your brother disappeared," he said as they drove through the endless trees. "But I remember the case. Whole town did." Grace nodded. Her voice caught somewhere between her ribs. "Did you ever think he might still be alive?" Carl didn't answer, just looked out at the forest and said, "Sometimes the mountains keep their secrets." It took nearly an hour to get there. The path wasn't paved, just a narrow logging road with ruts deep enough to swallow a tire. They parked near a clearing, where sunlight trickled through the pine canopy like old gold. And there it was. Nathan's Corolla? Or what was left of it. The color was barely recognizable, sun-bleached and moss-covered. The windshield was shattered. The driver's door hung open like a forgotten memory. Grace stepped toward it slowly, heart pounding so loud she could barely hear the wind. She reached for the doorframe, and her knees buckled. A faded bumper sticker still clung to the back. "Keep the music loud." She remembered the day Nathan slapped it on, smiling like a kid, saying, "That's the motto, sis. No matter what." She ran her fingers over it, whispering, "It's still here, Nate." Carl gave her space, letting her move through the wreck like a museum of grief. In the passenger seat, under a layer of damp leaves and dust, she found his old flannel, the red one, torn at the sleeve. She held it to her chest like it still had warmth, and then she saw it. Tucked between the seat and center console, a leather-bound journal. Nathan's journal. She opened it with shaking hands. The pages stiff with age, but still readable. Inside were sketches, lyrics, pieces of thoughts scattered like stars across the paper. And then came the last entry. "It's colder than I thought. The engine's dead, no signal. I walked for hours, but the trees just kept going. I didn't tell Grace where I was headed. I didn't want to scare her. But I thought maybe if I made it out here, I'd find that sound. That's something that feels like truth. But all I've found is silence. Her eyes blurred. She turned the page. If someone finds this, I'm sorry. I never meant to disappear. I thought I had more time. Grace, if you ever read this, you were the only person who ever believed in me. That belief, it got me farther than you'll ever know. She dropped to her knees, clutching the book to her chest, sobbing into the forest floor. Carl knelt beside her after a while. We'll get the car out of here. Carefully. I promise. She nodded, but didn't speak. Her voice had folded into the trees. That night, Grace stayed at a little roadside inn. The room smelled like pine and old quilts. She placed the journal on the table, beside a lamp, and stared at it for a long time. She'd found him. Not in the way she'd hoped, but she found him. And in that quiet motel room, surrounded by scribbled lyrics and half-written songs, she realized something. Nathan hadn't run away. He'd chased something. A dream, a sound, a calling. And somewhere along the way, the world just swallowed him whole. The next morning, Carl handed her a box before she left town. We found this under the seat when we moved the car. Inside was Nathan's old handheld recorder, battery dead, cracked screen, but still intact. Grace took it home, and for days, she couldn't bring herself to press play, until one Sunday morning, when the sun looked just like it did the day Nathan left. She sat on the back porch, slipped in new batteries, and hit the button. Static. Then, testing. Okay. Grace, if you ever find this, don't roll your eyes. All right, I'm trying something here. Laughter. I think I finally found it. That chord I've been hearing in my dreams. It's real. I'm close. Just need one more day. Guitar strumming begins soft, searching, unfinished. Then silence. She closed her eyes and smiled, because it wasn't perfect. It wasn't finished, but it was him. Alive, hopeful, reaching. And now, he was finally home. The days that followed were a blur. Grace returned home to Montana with her brother's journal clutched like a second spine, and the recorder tucked gently in her suitcase, like it might break if she looked away too long. She didn't sleep much. Instead, she played the recording again and again. Headphones on, eyes closed. She memorized every crack in Nathan's voice, every hesitant strum of his guitar, every breath caught between words. It was like holding on to a ghost that still whispered. But the more she listened, the more something gnawed at her. The last thing he said, just need one more day. One more day. Not goodbye. Not I give up. Something about that line refused to let her go. That's when she noticed the map folded at the back of his journal. It was drawn in pencil, edges weathered, notes scribbled in the margins. Sound tunnel here. Wind through pines. Reverb incredible. Old ranger station marked. Might be shelter. Grace hadn't seen this before. It wasn't a trail map. It wasn't something he'd picked up at a store. It was a hand-drawn path through the forest, his last steps. Her hands trembled as she traced the route with her finger. A thought hit her like a cold wind. What if he didn't die where the car was? That night, she called Carl. You said there was no sign of Nathan's body. Right. Right, Carl answered cautiously. No bones, no clothes, not even blood, but animals. The weather. 10 years. I found a map, she said, in his journal. He was headed somewhere. Carl was quiet. Then I'll clear the search with the Forest Service. But Grace, it's been a decade. I know, she whispered. But what if there's more? 3 days later, they were back in Idaho. Just Grace, Carl, and a young ranger named Dana with a drone and a strong hiking stride. They followed the map line by line, stepping over mossy logs and frozen creeks, the forest swallowing their footsteps in silence. Hours passed. Then Carl stopped. "Up ahead," he said, pointing. "There's a structure. Looks abandoned." It was the old ranger station, just like the map said. Half collapsed, windows broken, one side sunken from snow rot, but still standing. Grace's heart pounded. She ran ahead, boots crunching through leaves. Inside, it smelled like dust, mildew, and memory. Cobwebs clung to every corner. And then, in the back room, a space no bigger than a pantry, she saw it. A mattress made of pine needles and a tattered sleeping bag. And beneath it, a box. She dropped to her knees and pulled it out with trembling hands. It was metal, rusted but still sealed. Inside, a half-used notebook, a cracked cassette tape, a lighter, a Ziploc bag of photos, and one final letter folded, yellowed, addressed in his familiar scrawl, Grace. She sat down on the dusty floor. Carl and Dana stood silently behind her. And she read, "Grace, if you're reading this, then I didn't make it back, but I hope you never stopped looking for me. Knowing you didn't. I thought I had more time, just a little more time to capture it, that sound, that feeling I've been chasing since we were kids. Remember how we'd sit in the basement, you doing your homework, me trying to write the perfect verse. This place, it has something. When the wind moves right through the trees, it creates this tunnel of sound. It's haunting and beautiful. I called it my cathedral. I stayed too long. Got sick. Maybe the water. Maybe exhaustion. I don't know. But if you find this, know this: I never left because I didn't love you. I left because I loved this feeling, the pursuit of something pure, and I always thought I'd make it home in time to share it with you. Tell Mom I tried. Tell her I heard her singing in my dreams. And Grace, you were the only home I ever needed." Tears streamed down her face. She couldn't breathe. She looked around the room and saw him in every corner, scribbling notes, humming melodies, holding on to this one fragile dream. Dana gently lifted the cassette tape from the box. "There's a ranger outpost nearby," she said softly. "We have a player there. We can listen." They hiked in silence. The trees swayed like they were mourning him too. At the outpost, they placed the tape into a dusty player. Dana pressed play. There was static. Then, guitar strumming. Slow, haunting, layered with the echo of wind through trees. Then Nathan's voice, soft, tired, but alive. "Still here, still chasing. Grace, this one's for you." The music that followed wasn't polished. It wasn't perfect. But it was real. It was everything he wanted her to hear. And when the final note played and the tape clicked to silence, Grace sat there for a long time, hands on her knees, heart wide open. She hadn't just found her brother's car. She'd found his last gift, his final truth. And though it broke her heart in all the right places, she finally understood why he never came home. He never meant to leave. He simply got lost in the sound of something beautiful. Grace Turner had always believed closure came like a door quietly shutting behind you. A moment, a funeral, a handshake with grief. But what she felt after leaving that ranger outpost wasn't closure. It was a storm, a strange mixture of sorrow, peace, rage, and something softer, something like understanding. She flew home with her brother's journal, the letter, and that tape recorder like sacred artifacts, objects that had once been lost to moss, and time now sat carefully on her kitchen table beside a cold cup of tea she kept forgetting to drink. She played the tape again, not to feel sad, not even to feel him, but to feel what he felt. That song imperfect, echoing with wind and raw strings, was him. Stripped down, honest. Not the Nathan who vanished, but the Nathan who existed fully in that cabin, chasing a sound only he could hear. That night, she pulled out the notebook from the metal box. She hadn't had the strength to open it yet. Inside, Nathan had begun mapping something deeper than trails and chords. He'd drawn diagrams of sound waves, echo patterns between pine and stone, sketches of the place he called the cathedral. He was trying to explain the beauty he'd found, not for critics or engineers, but for her. On the third page was a line that stopped her cold. Grace sees the world in quiet details. I hope she forgives me for disappearing, but maybe, if she finds this, she'll see I didn't run. I listened. That was the moment her grief shifted. Because for 10 years, Grace had carried a wound full of unanswered questions. Why didn't he call? Why didn't he come back? Was it her fault? Was she not enough? Now she realized. He hadn't meant to vanish. He simply followed something sacred into the woods. And the world, impatient and loud, let him go unheard. For days after, she didn't speak much. Not because she was shutting down, but because she was absorbing. Absorbing the truth of who her brother really was, absorbing the gift he'd unknowingly left behind, and realizing maybe for the first time how alike they truly were. Grace had lived her life by duty, by quiet, invisible rules. She worked at the same library her mother had once managed. She kept the same furniture her father built before he passed. She made tea the same way every morning, as if routine was the only thing keeping her grounded. But Nathan had been wild, a song that refused to be written in straight lines. And in that contrast, she'd always felt small, safe, but small. Now, for the first time, she didn't see herself as the sister left behind. She saw herself as the keeper of something powerful. So she made a decision. She would share his story, not with news outlets, not with podcasts or interviews, but with people who listened. She returned to the forest a month later, this time alone. She carried with her a field recorder, a journal, and Nathan's music. She found the cathedral again, that space where the trees bowed to each other and let the wind pass through like a hymn. She stood in the center, and she played his tape, letting his music float out into the wild. Your song never got to meet the world, she whispered, so I brought it back here, to the place it was born. Birds stirred above her, leaves rustled, and for one brief moment, the wind curved just right and the song played back, echoed, carried. Grace closed her eyes, tears trailing down her cheeks, as her brother's unfinished melody circled her like a memory reborn. When she got home, she created a website, the Cathedral Project. It wasn't fancy, just a space to upload his journal pages, the tape recording, his letter, and the story of what she found. Within days, musicians began emailing her. Then sound engineers, then hikers, poets, dreamers. They'd never met Nathan, but they recognized him, because they, too, had once felt alone in their calling. A young composer in Iceland messaged her. I read your brother's words and wept. I've always chased a sound I couldn't explain. His story reminded me why I started. An old man from Vermont wrote, I lost my brother to silence, too. Thank you for making his voice echo again. Grace didn't expect it. She hadn't planned on building a movement. But maybe that's how real things begin. Not with fireworks, but with a whisper that finds a home. Months passed. Then a year. Grace began taking trips to forests, cliffs, abandoned churches, coastal caves, places where sound lived in strange ways. She called them echo points in honor of Nathan's notes. And at each one, she played his song. Sometimes a stranger would sit beside her. Sometimes she was alone, but always he was there. Not in the ghost sense, but in the way truth lingers quiet. steady, and heard. One evening, she sat on her porch, listening to a newly mastered version of Nathan's track, now cleaned up and layered with soft cello and ocean wind. She watched the sun dip below the horizon and smiled because she no longer felt the ache of not knowing. She felt the fullness of understanding. Nathan hadn't vanished. He became a part of something bigger. He had found the sound he'd been chasing. And now, so had she. It had been nearly 6 months since Grace Turner created the Cathedral Project, and she still couldn't believe how far it had reached. Emails poured in from across the globe, from music teachers in small-town Kentucky, to indie bands in Berlin, to a blind saxophonist in New Zealand who said Nathan's story helped him compose again. She responded to every message, not because she felt obligated, but because something in her had changed. She no longer saw herself as the girl left behind. She was a messenger now, a keeper of a voice once lost in the trees. Still, there were quiet moments when she wondered if the ripples would fade, if Nathan's story would eventually be buried again under newer news, louder voices, faster content. Then came the letter. Not an email. A letter, real paper, typed, stamped. No return address. Just one line at the top. Private Archives, Columbia Records, Nashville Division. Her hands trembled as she unfolded the rest. Dear Miss Turner, we recently came across a circulating recording attributed to your late brother, Nathan Turner, via the Cathedral Project website. One of our senior producers recognized fragments of a melody from a 2009 private audition tape Nathan submitted prior to his disappearance. We'd like to speak with you about a potential posthumous project and share with you something we think he meant for you to hear. Grace read the letter 3 times before sitting down. A private audition tape. Nathan never told her he'd submitted anything. She thought about the tape from the forest, raw, unfinished, fragile. And then this something more refined, maybe even professionally recorded. It was like learning her brother had left behind a second voice, and the world was just now uncovering it. 2 weeks later, Grace walked into the Columbia Records building in Nashville, heart pounding. The walls were lined with gold records, photos of legends, and plaques she didn't recognize, but instinctively respected. She felt wildly out of place in her thrifted cardigan and worn-out boots, but she didn't care. Because this wasn't about her. It was about him. A producer named Jesse Hartwell, mid-50s, salt and pepper beard, soft voice, met her with a handshake that lingered just long enough to say, "I've been waiting to meet you. I knew your brother," he said softly, guiding her down the hallway. Not well, but enough to know he had something special. We only met once. Grace blinked. He never told me. Jesse nodded. He was quiet, raw, nervous as hell. Brought his own mic setup and insisted on recording in the studio corner instead of the booth. He smiled. We thought he was strange. Brilliant, but strange. Grace smiled through the tightness in her throat. That sounded exactly like Nathan. In the control room, Jesse slid in an old hard drive. This is what he left with us. He pressed play. It began like the forest tape, but this was cleaner, the strumming sharper, the tone warmer. Nathan's voice drifted through the speakers, older than she remembered, but so familiar it made her chest ache. "I don't know if this song is good enough," he said into the mic, sheepishly, "but I know who it's for." Then came a new melody. Not from the tape, not from the journal. Something else. A song she'd never heard. Lyrics about a girl who saw the world in stillness. About a brother who got lost chasing echoes. About home not being a place, but a person. About Grace. Tears spilled freely down her cheeks as Nathan's voice sang the last note. Jesse didn't speak for a while. He just let her sit in it. Then quietly, he said. "We'd like to produce a tribute album. Using this recording, your project, and maybe even the environmental sounds you've been collecting. Not for profit, but to preserve something we think the world needs to feel." Grace could barely speak. "You think people will listen?" He leaned forward, eyes kind. "They already are. Over the next few months." Grace worked closely with Jesse and a team of musicians artists who resonated deeply with Nathan's story. They layered his melodies with forest winds, ambient cathedral echoes, even fragments from the broken tape recorder that once sat forgotten in the woods. They called the album Lost and Found. Grace insisted the liner notes include Nathan's full letter, his journal excerpts, a message to other echo chasers, as she called them, dreamers who walk into the wild with nothing but hope and a melody. Then something unexpected happened. A high school choir in Oregon emailed Grace asking for permission to perform Nathan's final song at their spring concert. They called it The Sound That Waited. A month later, a viral TikTok of their performance reached 3.2 million views in 2 days. Someone wrote in the comments, "I didn't know Nathan Turner, but somehow I feel like I've been waiting my whole life to hear his song." That was the moment Grace knew. Nathan didn't vanish. He transformed. Into music, into movement, into a language of grief, wonder, and return. Years ago, she'd believed closure came when you found what you lost. But now she saw the truth. Sometimes, the greatest closure is realizing they left something for you to carry forward. Something only you could carry. And that burden had become a gift. Before all this, Grace Turner had lived a quiet life. Predictable, contained. She showed up to work at the town library every morning at 8:30, made her tea with 1 sugar cube, and never left her home without a book in her bag and a memory in her pocket. She was the kind of woman who held pain like a folded letter tucked away, but never thrown out. But now, she found herself speaking on stages, sharing her brother's story with crowds of people who clutched tissues, not phones. People who didn't just listen, they felt. At first, it terrified her. She wasn't a performer. She wasn't eloquent. She didn't know how to be someone who held attention. But then she realized she wasn't speaking for herself. She was speaking for Nathan, for every sibling who'd waited by a window, for every dreamer who'd walked into the trees chasing a sound only they could hear. And once she understood that the words came easy, at one event in Seattle, after sharing her story, a boy no older than 15 came up to her. His hands shook as he held out a wrinkled notebook. "I write songs," he whispered, "but my dad thinks it's a waste. He says I'll never make anything of it." Grace took the notebook, flipped through a few pages. The lyrics weren't polished. Some lines didn't rhyme, but she saw the fire in them, the ache Nathan once had, the yearning. She looked at the boy and said, gently, "Then you're already making something of it. Don't stop." The boy cried. So did she. Moments like that changed her. Grace began organizing echo circles, small gatherings of people in parks, forests, or even abandoned churches, where they shared sounds that made them feel something. Not perfect music, just raw sound. Children bringing in voice recordings of waves crashing on rocks. An old woman sharing the hum of her late husband's wind chimes. A teenage girl playing a voicemail from her mom, now gone. One day, a blind man played the sound of his cane tapping down a hallway, paired with a piano chord. And in that room, everyone heard something deeper than notes. They heard connection. Grace kept traveling. She visited the cathedral again. This time with a film crew, an indie documentary team who'd been following her journey quietly. They didn't stage scenes or script lines. They just followed, listened, waited. She took them to the site where Nathan's car had been found, to the ranger cabin, to the place where his last song echoed through the trees. And when she stood in the middle of the cathedral and played that song again, now with layers of harmony added from musicians across the world, the camera didn't need to zoom in on her tears, because everyone watching would feel them. She used the documentary's proceeds to start a foundation in Nathan's name, the Turner Echo Trust, a home for lost voices and unheard music. It offered grants to young musicians who'd never had access to equipment or even the encouragement to begin. It funded forest soundwalks, rural music therapy programs, and grief processing workshops through sonic storytelling. Grace went from being the woman who'd once begged for answers to the woman offering space for others to ask their own questions. Back home, the town that had once pitied her, the poor girl whose brother disappeared, now looked at her with reverence. Not because she was famous, but because she had turned heartbreak into healing. She was invited to speak at the university where Nathan had once auditioned and been quietly rejected. The music department had found a copy of his submission. After playing it publicly, they awarded him posthumously an honorary degree in composition. Grace accepted it in tears, then placed it on the shelf beside his journal. But perhaps the moment that most reflected her growth came not from a stage, but from silence. It was a Tuesday evening. She stood in her small kitchen, boiling water for tea. She opened the window and heard it, a quiet breeze slipping through the trees outside, the echo of a single wind chime her neighbor had hung, a dog barking faintly in the distance. It wasn't music, but it was life, and Grace realized she didn't need to chase sound anymore. She'd become someone who listened fully, to grief, to stillness, to the melody tucked inside every ordinary moment. One morning, she sat at her desk and opened a new journal. For the first time, the name written at the top wasn't Nathan's. It was hers. "This isn't the story of a girl who found her brother's car," she wrote. "It's the story of a woman who found herself through what he left behind." She paused, then added, "Sometimes the music we're searching for isn't a song. It's a way back to feeling alive." Grace Turner had once been a keeper of someone else's dream. Now, she was a builder of her own. And every word she spoke, every tear she let fall, every song she shared was proof that love doesn't end when a person is gone. Sometimes it only begins. The auditorium was silent as Grace Turner stepped up to the microphone. It wasn't the biggest venue she'd spoken at. In fact, it was just a modest high school theater in upstate Vermont, faded red curtains, folding chairs, a squeaky floorboard dead center stage. But tonight, it was full of students, parents, teachers, and people who had heard about a woman who carried her brother's voice through forests, wind, and silence, and somehow came out singing. Behind her, a projector glowed with the words, "The sound that waited," a celebration of unheard music, of stories that waited to be found. She looked out into the crowd and saw a girl in the front row holding a violin with shaking hands, a boy behind her with hearing aids and a beat machine tucked under his arm, a mother with her teenage son in a wheelchair, gently tapping his fingers to an invisible rhythm. These were not audiences, these were echoes, reflections of the same silent yearning Nathan had once carried into the trees. And now they were here to listen. Grace took a deep breath. "I used to think that grief was something you survive, like a storm that hits. And if you're lucky, you stand up afterward." She paused. "But I've learned that grief isn't a storm. It's a tide. It comes and goes, and the trick is not surviving it, but learning how to float with it." She let that sit for a moment. 10 years ago, my brother Nathan disappeared. All I had was a car no one could find, a voice no one remembered, and a heart full of questions that never got answered. She stepped slightly forward, her voice steady now. "But now, I realize Nathan didn't disappear. He left a trail, a melody, a map. And while the world forgot him, the forest didn't, and neither did I. She reached into her coat pocket and pulled out Nathan's recorder. It was old, scratched, held together with tape, but it still worked. She pressed play, and the same sound that had echoed through pine trees and ranger stations now filled the room. Nathan's voice. "If you ever find this, Grace, thank you for always believing in me. I hope the music finds you. I hope it finds them too." As his guitar picked up, something incredible happened. From the back of the auditorium, one by one, students stood up with their instruments. A cello, a trumpet, a boy with nothing but a tambourine and a smile. And then the violin girl in the front stood too, and they began to play with him. Grace hadn't planned it. It wasn't staged. But it happened. Somehow, they knew the chords, or maybe they didn't. Maybe they just followed the feeling. The room filled with sound. Raw, imperfect, alive. By the end, there wasn't a dry eye in the place. People didn't clap. They just sat there, holding something invisible between them. Something like peace. Grace closed her eyes and whispered, "You made it. Nathan, they're listening." After the performance, dozens came up to her. A retired music teacher whispered, "Your brother's song reminded me why I started teaching." A boy with autism handed her a drawing of trees with sound waves drawn between them. "I hear music in places," he said, "like your brother did." Grace knelt down, took the paper in her hands, and said, "Then never stop listening." In the months that followed, the Turner Echo Trust grew faster than she ever imagined. Not because of publicity, but because people needed it. They needed a place where their quiet mattered, where their grief had rhythm, where their loss could make music. Workshops opened in rural towns, where music therapy was paired with forest walks and journaling. Students wrote original compositions inspired by wind, water, and memory. Families gathered once a year in a nationwide event called Echo Day, where they played one sound that reminded them of someone they loved and let that sound rise together. It wasn't just about Nathan anymore. It was bigger than him. It was about every brother who didn't come home, every song that never got sung, every voice that still waited in silence. One fall morning, Grace returned to the ranger cabin in Idaho alone. She stood where Nathan once wrote his last words, and she added one of her own etched into a small wooden plaque she placed by the door. It read, "This is where he disappeared, and where I began." She sat down outside, closed her eyes, and listened. And for just a moment, she swore she heard it. A faint melody. No guitar, no wind, just the sound of everything Nathan never got to finish, finishing itself through her. She smiled and whispered, "We found it. Sometimes the people we love don't leave us behind. They leave us a path to follow." For 10 years. Grace Turner lived with silence, unanswered questions, fading hope, and the ache of not knowing. But in chasing her brother's final steps, she didn't just find his truth, she found her own voice. Nathan didn't vanish in selfishness or neglect. He vanished in pursuit of something pure. And that pursuit left echoes, music, memory, fragments of soul that, when pieced together, became something even stronger than closure. It became legacy. This story reminds us that healing doesn't always arrive with answers. Sometimes, it arrives in the moment we decide to keep listening to pain, to silence, to each other. Grace's journey wasn't just about discovering what happened to her brother. It was about learning that some people finish their story through the lives they've touched, and that love, when carried forward, never really ends. The end. Up next, 2 more stories that will stay with your heart long after the music fades. Click to continue this journey, and don't forget to hit subscribe if you believe every voice deserves to be heard.